You're listening to Karibu on Kaya FM 95.9, the home of the Afropolitan. Of all the challenges we face in South Africa and the continent today, there's a view that the biggest of them all is leadership, or the lack thereof. That's why our special guest tonight is Dr. Reuel Khoza, who's a businessman, an entrepreneur, intellectual, author, and sometimes farmer. Believe it or not. Welcome to Karibu, Dr. Khoza.
Thank you very much, Mike. I do appreciate the opportunity to chat.
Yes, you have written and talked extensively on the subject of leadership. You've written books. One of your books, some of them are Let Africa Lead, Attuned Leadership, etc. Now, I would like to find out, before we go to the issue of leadership, because you're one of the foremost people who talk about leadership a lot. But before you started talking and thinking a lot about leadership, where did you come from? Some people think that leaders are born. They just, if it's your bad luck not to be born a leader, you are doomed for the rest of your life. How did it happen for you?
Oh, my sense on the perennial controversy or debate about whether or not leaders are born or made is that leaders are born, then made. And a good number of them actually unmake themselves by dint of the misdemeanors, misbehaviors, and in some instances, huge faux pas that they are blamed of, and they find themselves losing their leadership. So born, then made, and remain in leadership, or get unmade by dint of what it is you do that is untoward where the followership is concerned, as perceived by them. So in my particular case, I had an abiding interest in leadership from high school. In fact, perhaps even a little earlier, representing even our primary school in debates. So there is a sense in which even being the lead debater in school positions you in a leadership position, as it were. And as early as when I was in Standard 3, I admired one school principal who was the principal of our particular school, which is Mission School, Athasit Mission School, that started from sub-A to matric. And the man had qualifications that we could only dream of. He had a BSc and a BD. And he was quite proud of those, so those were actually plucked on his door. And I said even to my peers and contemporaries that when I grow up, I will be a school principal. And I thought that was too ambitious. But that particular little spark stayed on throughout. I am not any school principal right now, but by perhaps God's will and application, I am chancellor of a university. At one stage, I was chancellor of 2 universities. So I believe that's kind of a principalship.
And on the other hand, you've held key positions in business. You've been chairperson of Nedbank. You've been chairperson of ESCOM at some point.
Correct, yeah.
How did the transition happen? First, where did you grow up?
I was born and brought up in Bushbuckridge. Initially, I was a head boy and a shepherd, looking after my grandfather's livestock, if you like, his wealth on the hoof, which I was later on to go back to because I'm currently also a farmer, farming in avocados and macadamia nuts, but also significantly farming in cattle, a substantial number of cattle. I believe my grandfather would be quite proud of that. But I think I'm deviating a little bit. The whole thing about a deeper abiding interest in leadership started when I was at university. When I was doing my honors degree, I was president of the Psychology Society. At the same time, I was chairman of the Choral Society. Because
this is the
University of Limpopo, which was at the time University of the North, which was actually almost the hub of, if you like, revolutionary thinking. With the likes of Onkgopo Tsetiro, who was our contemporary, was 1 year ahead of me. And virtually every year we would find issue to take with the authorities that were at the time. So my activities in the Psychology Society and in the Choral Society, where I insisted we should sing songs that had relevance, in other words, songs that had struggle messages, profound struggle messages like Modabi, led to me being fired after teaching psychology for only 1 year. And I then landed in business, working for Unilever, and all the time striving to understand things beyond the understanding that the average worker or average employee has, and striving to lead by way of doing things that break new ground.
Let's talk about leadership itself, because you've been one of the things that you've done is that you've in a manner of speaking, walked through the fire.
Correct.
For criticizing the political leadership in the country today.
Correct.
In your view, what makes for good leadership?
A number of things make for good leadership. I think first and foremost, perhaps as Churchill put it, you must have the necessary courage. Because without courage, you are not going to raise the kinds of issues that will ruffle the feathers of the leadership that be. But very, very importantly, I want to believe that there are a number of elements that make for good leadership. I have gone on record as saying that anybody who wants to lead me in the 21st century must satisfy a number of criteria, must stack up against a number of criteria. For one thing, he or she must be able to deal with complexity. Because the world is becoming progressively more and more complex. And in order for one to deal with complexity, one has got to be sufficiently schooled. Second, if you want to be my political leader, you must also understand that you'll be leading in a political economy. So understand politics and economics and understand the interplay between those two. Way beyond understanding the culture and dynamics of the nation that you purport to lead.
Must a leader be popular?
Popularity, there's nothing wrong with. Populism, there is something fundamentally wrong with, because populism, it's about being seen to be lovable for the wrong reasons, whereas popularity may be a function of you doing things right. Populism is a function of you selling yourself successfully, perhaps somewhat irrationally, and perhaps in ways that are somewhat untoward and self-serving. Such as we have experienced in our own political economy. In addition to what I've said earlier on about leading in the 21st century, I think you must also understand the phenomenon of globalization and globality, and understand how you might actually make sure that the people that you lead benefit from globalization and from the phenomenon of globality. But you could actually do all of that fairly effectively. You do have thugs that succeed in leading in thuggery. So the underlying key theme for sound leadership is actually ethics and morality. You must have moral authority. And the epitome of that moral authority in our lifetime was Utatu Mandela. What made him the popular leader that he was effectively moral authority. So if he says, let's go in this direction, people no longer really question, because they knew he would have thought through that and he would lead as he preaches, whereas others will preach, clean leadership, clean governance, when in fact they are themselves the epitome of corruption. I want to believe that humility also is very, very important. What I've learned about humility perhaps is summed up in the limited interface that I had with Walter Sisulu. Very, very humble. When we first met, I wanted to introduce myself. He said, don't, because I know you. I mean, little me.
It must have surprised you.
Yeah, and I said, no, I know you. I actually read no less than 3 or 4 articles that you wrote when I was in jail. And I thought perhaps that was a bit of a fluke. 9 months later, we meet, and I tried to introduce myself. He said, but then I told you not to bother to introduce yourself because I know you. And he then recalled our first interface. That led me to coining the phrase, perhaps standing at the kingdom of leadership. Anyway, instead of the angel Gabriel, you'll have the angel humility. Because if you go into a situation haughty and unduly self-assured, those that you purport to lead in that situation will work very, very hard to actually pull you down. But if you are humble, they will actually do a lot to actually prop you up and even lift you to even loftier heights.
Now, the whole issue of leadership and morale. So some people might say, actually, you're asking for pie in the sky. You're looking at for example, the political leadership in the country, and you say, no, it must be moral, it must be upstanding, it must be humble, it must be. Some people might say, no, actually, maybe it's not attainable. That political leadership is different.
I don't know. Perhaps they could be right to a limited extent, but in reality, where South Africa is concerned, we would actually be blind to reality because we have had somebody who actually stood very much on ethical ground, whose command of the leadership role reached out beyond South Africa into the continent and into the world, and got revered for his leadership, and that was Nelson Mandela. And over and above preparing for himself for the leadership first, by understanding the dynamics of traditional leadership. He was born into royalty, and he made a point of actually getting to understand how leadership is carried out in African royalty. But in due course, he also prepared himself legally by training in the law. And when all is said and done, what puts Nelson Mandela apart is his moral authority. So it's not pie in the sky, it's real. His leadership is worthy of emulation. Those that say it's difficult to emulate are actually kidding themselves, and they just are meant to be self-serving and corrode their believability, their credibility.
What about business? I mean, you've spent much of your time in the business world in a leadership position, talking to business leaders.
Correct.
Do you find that that kind of leadership is there in business today?
Oh, very much so. There are a number of companies that are clearly wholesome, clearly ethical. But the banking community lately have raised a few questions, but by and large, you cannot run a bank, a respectable bank, unless you run it ethically, unless you run it honestly, unless you actually run it believing that you are there at other people's service, in fact, largely your customers, but not only your customers, your shareholders, not only your shareholders, but even those that regulate you. So it's relationship management predicated on honesty. And for business to really thrive in leadership, I believe there are a number of things that they need to deliver on. And those we have written about lately in King 4, and I deputize for Mervyn King there. Right at the beginning, we talk about leadership, and we believe that the key elements of that would be first and foremost competence. You got to be competent. Otherwise, don't step onto the leadership position. It is from your competence that you'll be credible.
So you must know what
you must know what it is you're talking about, and you must understand your set of values, because the best of leaders are predicated on a sound value system, and they are beckoned by a compelling vision.
Now, Dr. Khoza, before we broke, we were touching on the topic of business and what is happening in business. But let's talk about black business. Since 1994, the argument, even today, people will say, look at the stock exchange, it's not transformed enough. Black people need to get greater share, we don't have enough black managers. We don't have enough black women managers, etc. Now, the question is what is the social compact here? Is it empowering black people for the sake of it, or are we saying society must be better for it? What is the role of black business today?
I think ultimately a society at large must be better for it. But in order for that to come about, they've got to be catalysts. And that's where black leadership actually comes in. They have to have a catalytic effect on the transformation that we would like to see happening. And the question you might ask is, have we actually ensured that actually that happens? And regrettably, the response will be yes and no, and largely no. You do have a number of companies that have actually succeeded.
These are black
companies. Yeah, like take Shanduka, for instance, before Cyril left for politics.
This is Cyril Ramaphosa.
I think that was one of the shining examples of success. It may have had a few flaws, but by and large, you talk success. His brother-in-law by marriage, Patrice Motsepe. If you look at the IRM, you cannot say that materially that is not successful. It is.
This is African rainbow
minerals, and that entire empire. And given that later on he actually established a trust, which benefits a great deal from the success of his company, and dedicating a substantial chunk of his income to that, and also getting into sports and funding sports. Which is also a catalyst also for change. You could say, I mean, if you mention those two, you could say that there's been success. But I mean, you're talking about a country that has politically transformed, that is largely led by blacks. Success in this context will be defined as black people owning, particularly the 2 decades following the advent of democracy, black people moving inexorably towards owning 75 to 80% of the wealth of the country, because we're talking about equitability, we're talking about fairness, and we're very, very far from that. Many of the attempts that we actually embarked on are somewhat limp-wristed. They are not as good as they should be. If you take the National Development, the NDP, the National Development Plan, it's a 400-page document. I don't know how many people will actually remember having read.
Quite intimidating.
Quite intimidating. But not only that, even the summary. If you talk about the vision is it's very, very good poetry, but very, very difficult to remember. If you talk about the American dream, for instance, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, just about all Americans.
Very simplified.
Even I can remember that. But if you ask me about the NDP and what it actually stands for, I would battle, even though I've read it. And I take trouble to understand things, but to summarize it will be difficult. So that's one area where we fall short. We try to be too sophisticated. We should actually look for a plan that has elegant simplicity or simple elegance in what it is actually stands for. Your question was
the role.
Should we have leadership that actually makes sure that the greater good actually benefits? Certainly. And in order for us to do that, black leadership must step onto center stage. Now, in order for you to step onto center stage, you don't step onto center stage simply because you want to. You actually have to be prepared. And that preparation has got to be deliberate and purposeful education. That preparedness must also be marshalling what forces we have and aligning them in a given direction in a manner that is believable, in a manner that is seen to be clean and ethical, as opposed to, misleading for the self-aggrandizement and self-enrichment of a small elite. And we have tended to battle a great deal where that is concerned. One, even in terms of competence, the leadership right at the top battle with competence.
But in business, is not part of the problem a historical one? To say that, the way we constructed the BEE, for example, to say, go find a black partner, full stop. And the black partner comes in, and they not clue what's going on in it, and they are happy to not know.
That's very, very, it's a very pertinent question. Black economic empowerment as conceived from the time when it became fairly popular was conceived not necessarily by ourselves. We might have made some input. There was a commission that was led by Cyril. At the time, Cyril was more of a political figure than a business figure. There were a number of people that actually worked with him, but I think our input was very, very limited. We should actually have thought a lot more deeply about what it is we wanted to do by way of transforming our society. And there are a number of key elements that we should actually have insisted on. One, where the ANC leadership is concerned, they should actually have insisted on meritocracy and make sure that the emerging young black leadership is actually imbued with the necessary education, with the necessary expertise, by way of exposing them to the elements that actually make them that way, learning here and learning elsewhere in the world in a systematic fashion. I'll give you an example of what we were able to do when I was at ESCOM, for instance. We felt that women representation in management was limited. So what we did was go out and recruit young women with BSc degrees and put them on a program with Warwick University, 40 of them. And all 39 out of the 40 actually passed their master's degrees, and we got them employed in the organization. That way, transforming or addressing the challenge of the absence of blacks in
actually
senior positions and the absence of black women. Direct intervention. Imagine if a program like that was replicated by the top 200 companies in the country.
But why is that not happening, Dr. Khoza? It seems
it's
common sense.
It's lack of visionary leadership. Those in leadership positions tend not to be good listeners. Tend not to be good listeners. So you go to them with a program and suggest to them what to do, because it does not fall in line with their ideology. And as you and I know, ideologies are emotionally charged beliefs. They're not necessarily
They're not rational.
They're not rational. So you wind up, when I was at the bank, for instance, following 2007, 2008.
At Nedbank.
Yeah, at Nedbank. I had a fair amount of influence where the bank was concerned and where Old Mutual was concerned. And we felt we could make a difference. Led by me, a black person, and some of the black people that I worked with there, the municipalities and local authorities were battling essentially because they did not have qualified, sort of big home type graduates. And we offered to fund a whole team of BCom graduates throughout the country, and we're going to pay for those, and we're going to try and match them or pair them with qualified white and black people who are about to retire. And we were told, unless we actually work through an organization that they had identified, they're not welcoming our intervention. And imagine if a bank like that, and we're number 4, if all of the banks actually did something like that about paying for young people to be trained on the job with the banks or the corporations themselves actually paying, what would happen in 3 years' time?
And they still wanted an intermediary.
They wanted an intermediary where one or other or a good number of them had some share. And that intermediary was less qualified than we were. If you take Nedbank and Old Mutual in combination, I mean, we loomed very, very large. And then you say to us, the only way you can implement, go and work with organization X.
A startup organization.
It's surefire to say, well, don't work with us.
Yeah.
So when I say lack of vision, a lack of ability to listen to recommendations by business, where political leadership is concerned, was one of the obstructive forces. That's exactly what I mean.
But let's talk more about BE itself. One of the biggest criticisms has been that it has benefited a few, at the expense of the majority.
That's
Is
true.
that a fair criticism?
I think it's a very, very fair criticism. I mean, if you think of what some of us are trying to do lately, take the Khoza family as a function of dabbling in private equity has made a bit of money. I wanted to build a school. The bureaucracy that I had to go through just to build a school that I was not going to benefit from took me 7 years. Right now, I would like to build at least 2 or 3, develop what you might call regional commercial centers in the Bushbuckridge area and the Tulamash area.
These centers would be like what?
These centers, instead of just going in and building a shopping center, we would build a shopping center, we would build a civic center where the communities would actually meet. We would build a hotel, we would build a private school, we would build a private hospital, all in the one center.
Okay.
So it's a small little town,
kind of
one-stop kind of thing. I am into my 5th year battling just to find the green light.
With the bureaucracy.
And if I were in Malaysia or in Singapore, that decision, that turnaround from government, particularly given that I was giving them detailed plans, the turnaround would be anywhere between 48 and 96 hours. And you'll be allowed to do that which you need to do. That is why the likes of Singapore, they have more jobs than they have people. And they actually try to attract people in the region to import
skills and people. But in terms of ordinary South Africans, South Africans, for argument's sake, your old bank, if I'm working at Nedbank or at Old Mutual and I'm an ordinary person, say I'm a cleaner, I'm a driver, I'm at that level. How can we make those kinds of people feel the benefit?
The BE scheme that we had at Nedbank actually was comprehensive from top to bottom, right down to the sweeper or the tea maker. The participation by employees was all employees as opposed to white collar stroke executives. And there are a few companies that have actually something similar that I can only talk about Nedbank. My sense there is that the concept of ESOPs, employee share participation schemes, has not been followed to its logical end. And BEE should actually follow that to its logical end and not just empower the few at the top. Another BEE scheme that has just vested that my company participated in was one by NAMPEC. That too had a section set aside for all employees, and employees as represented by the germane trade unions, so that you actually get to talk to the leadership of the workers out there.
So what was set apart, aside for the workers? Was it just shares? Was it training? Was it
is shares? Training is seen as mandatory. In a good number of the companies that I've actually worked with, training is mandatory because that's what actually is fundamentally transformative. Merely giving people shares doesn't really transform them. Also, the scheme as we had it, even as we have it now, more importantly, has got to do with sourcing from suppliers that are black. And that should be enforced, very rigorously.
You were involved in the reformation of the Black Management Forum way back. You were dealing a lot with the issues of black managers.
Correct.
Now, in today's South Africa, what should be the role of black managers? Because they seem to have disappeared. They're there often when they complain that they're not being given a break.
Correct.
But once they've got a break, they suddenly seem to lose their voice.
Correct.
What should be their role? Do they even have a role to play?
There was a debate at one stage about whether or not there was still a raison d'être for the existence of a Black Management Forum following the advent of democracy. Why talk black? Why talk Indian? Why talk white? Following the advent of democracy, some of us argued that we should be more concerned about stepping onto center stage. We should be the management forum, neither black nor white nor Indian, but predominantly black, because I mean, in the indigenous folk here are black, and there are those who said that there are still a number of issues to be addressed. Now, why are these not adequately addressed? One of my submission would be that we are plagued by fragmentation. You have the Black Management Forum, you have the BBC, you have the various chambers of commerce, etc.
The progressive.
You have the people that are putatively or ostensibly progressive, arguing amongst themselves, fragmented and not aligned and pulling in a given direction. So, but you could say that should not necessarily be wrong in itself. But the problem is that you wind up with a situation where there are oblique attacks to one another, and you wind up with a situation where you actually fall prey to what the pharaohs understood very, very well. Divide and divide and conquer, and keep the slaves warring amongst themselves. So we, in a sophisticated manner in the 21st century, find black educated elite, instead of actually working together in a manner that enables them to reach critical mass, to actually take charge of their fate and tackle the monster that is the so-called white capital in a manner that is effective. We find ourselves warring amongst ourselves.
Dr. Khoza, the other topic that you've talked a lot and written a lot about is Ubuntu. One view is that it has been hijacked and commercialized, and you've got Ubuntu panel beaters there, Ubuntu farming cooperative there, kind of. But none of those names actually relate to anything that has to do with what Ubuntu is.
Correct.
Can you talk to us about it? To say what when you talk about Ubuntu, to say we need to have Ubuntu, what do we mean by that?
We mean that at core, people should be put before everything, and that includes profit. The focus should be on human beings. Profit should serve the interest of human beings. The key element in the philosophy of Ubuntu is captured in the expression Umuntu, Ngumuntu, Ngabantu, in Nguni, and in Sutu, Motu, Kemotu, Kababa, Ngobatu. And in one of the minority languages, Mono, Imuno, Ihibanwanabano, in Shangan. And that also permeates through into leadership. Nkosi, Ngabantu, Hosi, Hosi, Iban. That's key. That's what the key elements of Ubuntu would be. I am because you are because I am. We are an interrelated superspecies. I do not achieve realization or actualization of myself unless I actually care about you. In business, what I have found is that the more successful business leaders are those who are passionate, but don't end there. It is those who are as passionate as they are compassionate. Those who have only passion and not compassion wind up actually destroying the companies that they purport to lead. So for me, Ubuntu should be pervasive. The late Steve Biko prided himself by saying that humanity may have had all manner of inventions, but where Africa is concerned, one thing that we are going to teach the world is humanizing capitalism. Humanizing the spirit of enterprise. And that's what we should actually be pursuing as Africans. The philosophy of, I think, therefore I am, the Cartesian philosophy of I think, therefore I am, is very, very limited. If you put that in juxtaposition to I am because you are because I am, it shows its shallowness.
It's far more advanced, actually.
The latter is far more advanced in that you cannot say simply because you think in the citadels of your whatever thinking, therefore you you exist. In reality, the language you use is not yours. You inherit it. The people that the socialization that you went through was not socialization in isolation, the socialization in a social context. The leadership that you might be providing is not leadership of self only, it's a leadership of others as well. So, I mean, it doesn't matter how you look at it, it is very, very limited, even though, I mean, it actually dominated the philosophy of an era. But all of that started in the mind of one single individual. But if you look at the philosophy of Ubuntu, it's organic. It actually, you cannot even say who actually first uttered Ubuntu Ngumulu
But
Gabantu.
off the back of that, can I ask you, have we actually sufficiently popularized it, particularly among Africans themselves? In other words, do you see, you are talking about it, you understand it, right? You believe in it. Do you see future generations of leaders, you know, like people now, say, who are in school, who are growing up, or people who are just joining the new leaders, the new managers, etc.? Do you see them 10 years, 20 years down the line preaching Ubuntu in the way that you are articulating it?
I do have a bit of a hope because for my sins, I actually teach as a visiting professor at no less than 3 universities. I get invited to talk about that in particular, to teach for 1.5 hours, and 4.5 hours later, I still find myself, you know, talking to the students. So the fact that they engage and don't even yawn, I mean, no one yawns in the class. It says to me there is abiding interest. So that actually gives me a bit of hope. But what would have given me greater hope is following the dispensation of Thabo Mbeki and incorporating the philosophy of Ubuntu in the philosophy of Batupili, you know, putting people first. If we had actually pushed that into, say, the next dispensation and actually made it more than just a mantra, made it a philosophy of life that is actually a lived philosophy, I would have been a lot more hopeful. I want to believe that perhaps as we go through the current conflict and vortex, there'll come a time when our political leadership will see the value of actually incorporating the African philosophy. Putting people first should be key.
Should we be putting this philosophy into the schooling system, into schooling curriculum?
Very much so. Instead of waiting until people are somewhat brain damaged at the university,
and then
send one, you know, lone ranger to come and preach that, or a few of these lone rangers to come and preach that, is not adequate. What you want to do is to make it part of socialization. And the main institutions of socializations are the school. The main institutions of socializations are the churches. So imbue them with that. You know, fortunately, some of the people that are respected, you know, like your Archbishop Makgoba, he actually believes in that a great deal, and he leads a very huge chunk of those that believe in Christ. The former leaders in this area were also flag bearers of black consciousness, like Father Smangaliso Mkhatshwa, who is now leading our moral rearmament, believe in this, and they dedicate their entire life to that. So there is hope, but the challenge is huge.
You've traveled a lot, you know, on either teaching or on business, particularly on the continent. We as South Africans are not to my by my observation, we don't travel a lot. Now, if you compare and we like to boast that we are the biggest economy on the continent, with a gateway to Africa, all these grand descriptions that we give ourselves. If you compare us to other African countries, how are we faring? Are we moving as fast as the fastest countries on the continent are moving in terms of economic development, economic and social development?
First 10 years of our democracy, I would have said the answer is an emphatic yes. But lately, unfortunately, I cannot say so. Essentially because we don't have an articulator of a compelling philosophy such as the African Renaissance. And also, as political leadership, we are fundamentally flawed in wanting to obliterate the legacy of those that come before us, simply because perhaps we've had one or two little differences. Instead of building on that, we want to have it obliterated. We want to have our predecessor completely forgotten. We forget that institutions live forever. Human beings come and go. So we should actually try and strive to build our institutional base. So as things stand now, South Africa may be a leader insofar as our economy is very, very substantial following the drop in oil price in Nigeria. I believe we may actually have gone into number one spot again, or moving inexorably there. But that in itself does not mean leadership. Leadership would call for continental vision. It would call for articulating a continental African or Pan-African mission. It would mean strategizing as a continent. And one has argued repeatedly about that taking the form of regional consolidation and regional visions that actually coalesce and pyramid to a continental a continental vision and continental mission and a continental grand design. Mbeki, Obasanjo, Bouteflika, and Abdul Wadei, when they were talking very much about the African Renaissance, showed the way. What I believe the AU should have done was to accentuate the positive elements of that in terms of the vision. And there is a bit of sort of limp-wristed support to what is called NEPAD, the New Partnership for African Development, with an implementation arm. But even that is not given the necessary support and imprimatur.
Your thoughts, now you're talking about NEPAD, your thoughts about the attacks on foreign Africans that have been happening?
As in
some people have said
xenophobia.
NEPAD opened the floodgates, and that's why you've got people from up north, all over South Africa, etc. What are your views on that?
My views are that humanity is interrelated, is intertwined, and that Africa, in essence, belongs to Africans. That a good number of the boundaries that we see, say a boundary between Mozambique and South Africa, is very artificial. The boundary between Zimbabwe and ourselves is a river, and that river has always been there. I mean, I cannot agree that the Khozas that are in Bulawayo are very different from the Khozas that are in Bushbuck Ridge, and the Khoza and
being across the river,
simply because there's a river. So I think we got to take a much more mature approach that effectively says that we actually belong together. If you talk China, people tend to believe China is a country. China is, in fact, a continent. And if you look at it in terms of the population, it's a bigger continent than we are. And when it comes to negotiate across borders with America, across borders with Africa, they come in as China. And if you look at the regions of China, they're much, much bigger than some of the countries in Africa. We just have to find a way of thinking nationally granted, but that as a building block. Think regionally as building blocks, and think continentally. And that way we will be able to stack up in challenging those that we have to deal with, particularly in a world characterized by globalization. You cannot, for instance, want to deal with China as tiny Lesotho, which is essentially just a small plot with an anthill for a mountain. But somehow it wants to behave like it's a fully fledged country. You can't win. If a mouse wants to engage in a dance with an elephant, there's no question as to who will be trampled over. And that's why, consistently we get defeated. They come here and negotiate with Angola. They come here and negotiate
like a
with...
divide and
there's
rule.
Divide and they still fragment. There's a new struggle, a struggle for Africa. A scramble, for Africa. It is just a lot more sophisticated. And our AU leadership, in my humble submission, failed to understand that in its enormity.
And just before you go, Dr. Khoza, if I'm a young African in South Africa today, what would be your message to me? Because people are telling me that I'm xenophobic, I'm a bad person, I do drugs, I'm lazy. What would be your message to young Africans today?
My message would be that there is hope, but that hope has got to be fueled. It's not hope that will actually continue burning unless we do something about getting it sufficiently fueled as a nation. I want to believe that nations succeed essentially because they have a national vision. In other words, there's something beckoning that says, come hither. Our youth must begin with an individual mission in life. What is your purpose? You came here for a purpose, and that purpose cannot be strengthened and buttressed by you engaging in drugs and stuff like that. You actually have to apply yourself. And as you apply yourself in terms of learning, you will gather the key element, the key aspect in anybody's success, and it is intellectual capital. Without intellectual capital, everything falls apart. It is a glue that brings things together. And I would suggest they should amass capital by way of applying themselves where education is concerned and be so well educated that they can actually stand up against a graduate from Harvard, a graduate from Oxford, a graduate from any European university. But having done that, find ways of rallying around a common vision at the national level and make common cause in an aligned fashion.